Vinit, you can start.
Hello all, good morning. I welcome you all on the second day of the TechCon. It has been very informative session on day one, and we expect a better session on day two also. And to chair first session of day two, we have chairpersons Dr. Amit Saraf and Dr. Anand Shankar. Dr. Amit Saraf is dynamic diabetologist and physician, senior physician at Jupiter Hospital, Mumbai. And he's DNB teacher and MD examiner also, and he's National Data Accounting member. I welcome him for the to chair the first session. And our second chairperson for today is Dr. Anand Shankar from Patna. He is founder chapter secretary of ISSBI Bihar chapter. He has organized various conferences. He is former chairman, is founder president of Aero Bihar chapter. I welcome Dr. Anand Shankar to chair the first session and request Dr. Saraf and Dr. Shankar to start the proceeding as soon as possible.
Thank you, Vineet. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the first world virtual diabetes technology conference of 2022. And I thank Dr. Bansi Sabu, Dr. Amit Gupta, Rakesh Parekh, and the entire organizing team for this very much informative and a beautiful conference, which we've been hearing for the last 48 hours. I'm sure today's day will be equally as exciting and as good as ever. To start the day with a bang, we have a keynote address and we have an equally dynamic speaker who will be doing that. He is Dr. Viral Shah, who's the associate professor at the Barbara Davis Center for Diabetes at the University of Colorado in Denver. His research focuses on clinical trials of diabetes technologies to improve glycemic control, translational research to understand the effect of diabetes on bone in type 1. He is the principal investigator on a number of clinical trials in type 1 diabetes, published over 120 research articles, including original article, invited reviews and editorials and book chapters over many, many publications. He served as various leadership roles such as Communication Director of Diabetes Technology Interest Group for the ADA in 2019 and 2020, Steering Committee member of Type 1 Exchange Clinical Registry and the ASAP Writing Committees. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Clinical Diabetology. So I welcome Dr. Viral Shah to this robust gathering, and he is here to speak to us this morning on a keynote address upon the topic of standardization of glucose and insulin data. Over to you, Viral. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Amit, for such a long and nice introduction. I really appreciate that. So let me share my screen. Do you see my screen? Okay, I'm going to put that on a presentation mode.
Yes, can be seen.
Okay, all right. Is it on a presentation mode on your side? Okay, all right. Yeah. I see we post thumbs up. Okay. All right. So again, thank you and morning to everyone in India. It's a late night in Denver, Colorado. And the topic I was given is the standardization of glucose and insulin data. My topic is, I'm sure it's very, very different than probably what you are hearing in this 2 days of meeting. It's more about the devices, technologies, and the use of AGP, time in range, and something like that. So I will talk more about that. Why are we talking about those things now? So my disclosure statement, I do receive grants and a lot of fundings from industry. So, you know, while I was preparing the talk, I think the best part to learn is to give a talk. And so it's a learning for me as well while I was preparing this presentation. And I just looked up in Oxford Dictionary that what's the definition of standard and standardization? And so the Oxford said that standard is an idea or a thing that's used as a measure, norm, model in a comparative evaluation. So let's say, for example, a centimeter or millimeters or inch, right? We need to come up with what is inch, defining that inch so that we can compare two different measurements in the same way, and something that everybody can understand. And standardization is the process of making standard. And so something that you are confirmed to a standard that you are defining, right? And so a couple of example, it's very interesting that, I feel like in our life, everything has been standardized, but we don't know much about that part. Like, for example, in India, no matter which state you go to, you always use the type B plug. You don't have to carry around different kind of plugs. It's a standardization, right? Because it makes your life easy. When you drive your car, you have a steering on the right side, US it's the left side, and it's wherever you go, it's the same, right? So everything is standardized so that we can live a life without chaos. It's so funny that I was just looking up, and even a toothbrush has some kind of a standardization. Those filaments has a very standard nomenclatures, the size and shape around that part, and how much pressure that it should exert on your teeth. So it's an interesting that our life revolves around the standards and the standardization around that. So why not in a healthcare? Of course, we do need standards in healthcare, and the example is the EKG. Whether I am reading this EKG or Dr. Chowda or Dr. Saraf or whoever is reading this EKG, we all will be reading in the same way. It's a PQRST, right? Everything has been standardized. Another example is the DEXA. Even though you use the Lunar, you use the Hologic machine or kind of like a different machine, but it reports in a T-score and a Z-score. And so you can understand, I can understand, anybody can understand, we can compare different results, even though the machines are different. And so in a nutshell, the standardization helps to reduce the variation in a clinical treatment and the patient outcome. Now think about that everyone interprets the ECG in a different way, then we cannot diagnose the condition. Everybody will say some different kind of a diagnosis, then it will create a chaos, how to diagnose, how to treat the condition. It definitely also helps to reduce errors and makes the treatment more predictable, controllable, and also it defines a clear responsibility of all the team members. So standardization, we live in an era that things are standardized, and that is also true in a healthcare that everything is being standardized. But my topic is not about talking about standardization of those electrical outlets, right? My topic about standardization of the glucose and insulin data. And so why I'm talking about that today, despite we live in an era that things are standardized, but the glucose and the insulin data is not. And in US, you have got 3 different pump companies. And on my left side, you can see it's a Medtronic, Omnipod, which is a patch pump, and Tandem. We have got 4 CGMs, Dexcom, Libre, Eversense, and Medtronic CGM. And there are plenty of meters. If you just kind of a Google, even though if you go in eBay or Amazon, you will find about 50 different kind of meters. There are some connected pins. Every one of them use their own independent software platform where you can download the data and visualize the data. Now, the problem is not that it's an individual software. The problem is that everyone reports it so differently that it's really difficult for us to really interpret and come together as in kind of like, okay, what would be the consensus around interpretation of that particular glucose or CGM data. And it's really hard. And I just took a screenshot here. You can see that all these kind of a different CGMs and different pumps and platform reports it so differently. Color is different, shape is different, the information is different. So it's really, really difficult for a physician to keep up with how to interpret that. And some of the reports are 14 pages long. Some of them are like, anywhere between 8 pages to 14, 15 pages. So now when you are seeing a patient and you have only 10 to 15 minutes of a time in front of the patient, how can you really review that 15 pages of data in a minute or two? It's nearly impossible, right? So we have to come up with the standardized way to report the glucose data. And so if you want to standardize that, then you have to define what's the glucose range. what should we consider as a normal reference range? And outside that is kind of an abnormal. Then you have to think about the visualization of that glucose data. And then, of course, everyone have a different opinion, right? So we have to come up with some kind of a consensus. Now, remember that the consensus is very different than guidelines. The guidelines are based on the evidences. Consensus is based on what we think together. So it's more of an opinion where we say, this is starting point. Let's start there. And then, of course, it has to be adopted by the societies, like, for example, American Diabetes Association, endocrine societies, and ACE, and so on. And then you have to spread it. You have to educate the educators so that the standardization becomes meaningful. Everybody would adopt it, and everybody will use that so that we can all speak in the same language. And so with that, what happened is in May of 2012, Hamsley Charitable Trust funded a meeting of all these experts from more than 70 centers across the United States. And this picture is the Jeff Center for Health Research, which is located in Tampa. So all these people meet in Tampa. And the only goal, they had 2 days of a marathon. And the marathon was only about, let's say, come to a consensus about how to use or report the glucose data. Let's define the glucose ranges. Let's define what's normal, what's abnormal. And then they came up with this called as now time in range, time above range, time below range. Now you can see here that it's very different than the time in range definition that we are using right now, right? So 70 to 180, 180 to 250, 250 to 400. Now in AGP right now, you don't have a 400. It's anything about 180 and 250, only two categories. So it just tells that how these things evolve over time. Things changes over time, and that's called a science, right? We have more data and we will change it over time. And you can also see that very interestingly, 2012 definition of low 70, 60, and 50. And now we have a 70 and 54. So anyway, I'm not going to go into the detail of that story, but this was the first meeting that was held in 2012 where everybody said, hey, let's just define it. Now, as I mentioned, that this was a kind of a consensus does not mean that it's an evidence, but you have to start from somewhere. So this was a starting point. And then over time, it get refined. And finally, the international consensus, which many of you were part of, came together at the ATTD meeting and said, hey, now it's a time to declare that these are the clinical targets for CGM glucose data interpretation. And then it defined time in range, 70 to 180 milligram per deciliter. And then level 1 hyperglycemia and level 2 hyperglycemia, which is 180 and 250. And then level 1 and level 2 hypoglycemia, which is 70 and 54. And then, yes, we understand that the one size do not fit everybody, right? So we have to also individualize therapies. So older adults, different goals. Pregnant patients, different goal. So this is a starting point. Remember that part. This is going to evolve over time. The definition of time in range, I am 99.99% sure it's going to change over time because 70 to 180, it's pretty wide. And that leads to a very wide estimation of A1C. So over time, this will change. Now, I mentioned about the standardization of the glucose variables. What about the visualization part? So this was David Rothbard and the Roger Mazet, very seminal work in 1987, way before we can think about really a glucose data. These guys came up with the way to report the glucose data and visualize it so that it's easy to understand. And then you can see that this is a very primitive graph that they came with, that it's a median interquartile range. And then you can define the glucose in a various ranges and the 24/7 kind of a day on the y-axis. And still, the AGP core remains with this first publication of Roger and David in 1987. So very, very beautiful work, very thoughtful work. And now we can understand that that work has evolved over time, 1987 to now 2017. So 2017, again, the international consensus met together and said, hey, now it's a time to say that how to report the glucose data or visualize the glucose data so that every one of us would be interpreting it in the same way and again talking in the same language. And so that's kind of called as an AGP, ambulatory glucose profile, which is a trademark and patented by the IDC. So Roger Maze was at the NIH and moved to the IDC later on. It's a little controversy around that part. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the AGP then became kind of a standard after 2017 because it was adopted by various society that includes the American Diabetes Association, ACE, and various other organizations. You all are aware about the AGP, so I'm not going to go into the details. And I'm sure in the 2 days of this diabetes technology marathon meeting, you will have a lot of lectures around time in range and why we should use the time in range and those kind of stuff. But this was kind of a consensus on reporting the glucose data or the visualization of the glucose data in the form of AGP. And now this was actually 2017 version of the AGP. The newer version is very different than this first version. So again, as I mentioned earlier, that things are evolving over time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, why we need a standardization? So that we can make our life easy in a healthcare, so that we can all speak the same language, so that the interpretation will be the same. So we can treat the individuals, we can compare the treatment, right? And so this is two really beautiful articles, again, feasibility studies, not a large randomized control or multi-center trial, but one from the IDC, another one is from Janice Wong at the University of California. And both of them have looked at like, okay, if we teach the physician on standardized way of visualizing the glucose data and interpretation of the glucose data, which is an AGP, would that help? And so the answer is yes. So what they did is that they looked at the time taken by the physician from the patients checking the front desk to the patient being treated by the doctor. And it takes about 16 minutes of a time. This was before kind of a standardization. And then after standardization, that time has reduced from about 16 minutes to 4 minutes. And so, yes, it helps. And the easiest part nowadays is that now during the study that they conducted, we had to use the codes and cable to download that. But every device that's available in the US now, and I'm talking about mainly the CGM and pump, has a Bluetooth. So it's connected to your mobile phone. All the data goes into the cloud. So you don't have to use any kind of a cable to really download the data. So practically speaking, this study is old enough, but if you really do the study now, then this time will be less than 2 minutes now. So the patient is checking at the front desk, to the patient is seeing you, and you are interpreting that AGP. Everything takes about 2 minutes or less. So that means you are improving the efficiency in seeing the patient, and not only the efficiency, but it is the more safer way of interpreting the glucose data and make some kind of a therapeutic changes. But things have changed after that. Did all the physicians are speaking in the same language? And the answer is no. So this is another article by Rich. What he did is that very simple study, but beautifully done. He asked the physician and divided them into two groups, expert and non-experts. Now, experts are self-expert, meaning by that I can say, hey, I'm an expert. Someone can say, I'm not an expert. The rough definition of an expert in this was that, okay, you are having at least 10 years of an experience in diabetes field, and you are seeing at least the one CGM data in a week, which is pretty narrow definition, or probably broad, not narrow, but it's kind of like a very conservative definition of expert. But anyway, divided into expert and non-expert. Everybody were given the 7 AGP profile, and that are marked as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, right? Now those profile are same, right? So for example, look at the number B. Okay, now focus on the number B, CGM profile, and I'm looking at the non-expert, which are 73 physicians, which were non-expert. The same AGP, 5 physicians said it's the best, 2 physicians said worse, and all are kind of in between, right? So despite that we are having a standardization about the AGP, the interpretation of AGP, still everybody has a different opinion about that. Now, difference in opinion is nothing wrong in a science. It's a healthy thing to do. But at the same time, what this article emphasizes that it needs more education. And so therefore, American Diabetes Association has now a totally different educational program called as Time in Range Education Program for primary care doctors. Excuse me. And so I'm hoping that over time, when we'll educate everybody that what's time in range, how to review the time in range, how to make an adjustment, that probably there's differences in the opinion or differences in thinking about those data would probably change over time. Now, what about not just the glucose data, but the glucose and insulin data? What about the patients when the patients are using insulin pump as well as the CGM or hybrid closed loop system, right? So I and Satish came up with the first, I call it a wake up kind of a publication telling the scientific community that, hey, it's a time to also standardize the glucose and insulin data rather than just the glucose data. Now, remember that the AGP is only glucose data so far, not the insulin data. And so in our publication, we highlighted a couple of things. We came up with about 6 metrics that we discussed in this article, and then some of the futuristic aspect around that part. And what we said is that the glucose metric should be reported as the same as an AGP, because now we all know about the AGP. We all are learning about the time in range, time above range, time below range, coefficient of variation and everything, right? So there is no point in changing that nomenclature at this moment. So we should have the same glucose metric data. However, we went into the details and said that we should provide a little bit of a more granular details on hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia reporting. And what I mean by that, like, let's say, for example, there are 2 individuals. Both individuals are spending time below 70 milligram per deciliter, which is in hypoglycemia of 5%. You would say guideline is about 4%. So not bad, but slightly higher than that. But now if I will tell you that the one person is having a hypoglycemia entire night, that entire 5% is throughout the night, versus that another guy who has a 5% but during the daytime. And now your opinion will change. The guy who is spending hypoglycemia, that 5% of the time in hypoglycemia at night, is more riskier than the guy who is spending 5% of the hypoglycemia but during daytime, because night hypoglycemia or nocturnal hypoglycemia are more dangerous. So not only the 5% of hypoglycemia is meaningful, but you need to know when it's happening, how often it's happening. So in this article, we talked about probably going into a little bit of a granular detail around the reporting of hypo and hyperglycemia. And again, I'm not going to talk into the details. Everything is there in the publication. If you're interested, you can read about that. And then we can also discuss about the insulin matrix that we should be reporting in this standardized glucose insulin data. And the most important thing is the user input. So a lot of patients who are entering like an exercise or sleep or other factors, I think there should be a way to report that part. And then there should be an AI system that can say, hey, based on the data that has been entered by the patient, this is probably and kind of that leads to some kind of a treatment decision. So for example, if the patient has a persistent postprandial hyperglycemia, then the system should tell you something about that. There is a persistent postprandial hyperglycemia happening 5 out of 7 times in a week. And therefore, it's more likely that you need to change insulin to carb ratio. So anyway, and then also we talked about that providing the details which matters the most to the physician. Like, for example, if you are using Medtronic 670G, in that kind of a hybrid closed loop system, the only 2 factor that really matters is the active insulin time and insulin to carb ratio. It's a basal independent system. So changing the patient's basal rate on an insulin pump really doesn't matter in Medtronic 670G. So in this kind of a reporting, you shouldn't be providing us those kind of details in a first page, which I call as an AP dashboard, because it's not a meaningful. And so we discussed a lot about what should be standardization, providing some kind of a granularity on different metrics. And not only that, but also taking the user input as well as customizing that depending on the system. It's very, very important. Also, we talked about the color coding. And Boris Kovacek from University of Virginia and his group developed this kind of a traffic light pattern, meaning by that the green, good, yellow, okay, and red means danger. And so we mentioned that the color coding matters in standardization. And so ideally in AGP, we should have a green, yellow, and red kind of a system. So AGP 2022 or 2021 actually changed last year. They changed their color coding based on our article. And as I already mentioned, that it should be adaptable, it should be customizable, and it should provide you the information that really matters the most, rather than providing all this kind of gobbledygook information that is not really helpful in making any therapeutic decision. Now, that article, as I said, that it was a wake-up call for the scientific community. And so those who attended the ATTD, and I met many of you at the ATTD, this was presented by the Revital Nimri, and this slide is actually from her. She was generous enough to provide me the slides. And so during that ATTD, they spoke about the international consensus on automated insulin delivery system. And there are 7 chapters. Each chapter was like governed by I think about 6 or 7 or about 10 physicians in some group. Each group prepared that report based on the evidences. And then there was a big meeting convened on May 26th. And then everybody discussed about their chapter and their part, and then came up with the consensus. So that paper is going to come out pretty soon. I'll say stay tuned. But in general, as I mentioned, that there are, I think, 7 or 8 components, and one of the component is that how to report and present the AID data. It's pretty much, they adopted everything that we suggested in our in first paper in DT&T. And it will look more like a kind of an AGP, because we all are familiar with the AGP, so that it will make life easier for all of us to really understand and interpret those glucose and insulin data together. Is that perfect? And I would say no. The Voltaire said in the past that the perfection is the enemy of good. So nothing is perfect. But I am sure that over time, things will get better and better and better. And we all will be talking about this glucose data, like what we are talking about the ECG at this moment, electrocardiogram, because the interpretation, if you give an ECG to 10 cardiologists, I'm sure that 9 out of the 10 would be on the same page. But if you give an AGP at this moment to 10 diabetologists, hardly 1 or 2 would come together, right? So, but I'm very optimistic that over time, this matrix will be refined. Over time, we will get all the educations around this glucose and insulin matrix, standardization of those metrics, and then things will change over time. With that, I'm going to end my presentation. This is my University of Colorado, and happy to take any questions if you have.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Viral Shah. It was a wonderful, eye-opening presentation, and this is a keynote lecture, so we are not going to have any question. Of course, you have any take-home message, you can always give. But this was a wonderful presentation of the evolution of the ambulatory glucose profile. And you started from how it has been done. And we are fortunate to have you here. And how we can use along with the insulin. So wonderful. Thank you so very much. And if you have any take-home message, please give us.
Nothing specific. As I mentioned in my talk, I would say that, things will change. It's evolving, and science, that's what it's a science is. Science evolves, right? It doesn't stay at the same level. So I'm sure that things will change over time. This metrics will become even better, refined based on the evidences, and we will have a less disconnection between us in understanding this data, and I think coming up with a treatment plan based on that data. So I'm sure it will be very helpful to all of us. And standardization is the way to reduce the chaos among us, I guess.
And that's how we do the studies and publish, and then the standardization will take place. Thank you so very much. Dr. Amit Saraf, you have anything to?
I think Viral, beautifully, I think a very, very important topic covered at the beginning of the day. Standardization is the way forward. Whichever we are men of science, until we don't standardize everything we do, cut across the entire globe, I think our work is not really as authentic as it should be. So I think a brilliant talk. On the behalf of everybody, let's give him a big round of applause for having a nice talk at the beginning of the day. And I think with that, me and my co-chair will sign off. And thank you, Viral. Handing over back to the organizing team for the next session.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, all the team of Diabetes Technology Group. And now I ask Amit to take over.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Viral. First of all, you have set the ball rolling for today, and right from with your keynote lecture. And we really appreciate that you agreed to speak at such a late hours in the US. We are very, very grateful to you, and we look forward for your continuous association and participation in the DTech and the DTech related events. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, and it's my pleasure. And have a wonderful meeting and wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.